Okay, thank you everyone for coming. Because of our little late start, we'll get right on to it. Thanks for coming to Hypothetical 2019, from car crash to train wreck. So firstly, I'll introduce our great panel today. In no particular order, we have Joe Chandler, journalist, science writer and educator. We have Associate Professor Deb Williamson from the Microbiology Unit, Diagnostic Unit here in the Doherty. Associate Professor Kirsty Buising, Head of the Victorian Infectious Diseases Service at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, but also located here. Dr Brett Sutton, Chief Health Officer from the Department of Health. And Dr Mark Sullivan, Managing Director of Medicines Development for Global Health. So for the audience, for those that are non-medical and non-microbiological or bacteriological, just a quick lesson. Some antibiotics are effective against many bacteria, and these are called broad-spectrum antibiotics. And some are effective against just a few bacteria, called narrow-spectrum antibiotics. As we know, billions of bacteria live on and inside of each and every one of us. And in fact, they keep us alive. However, some are pathogenic and cause disease, and some get to locations in the body where they shouldn't be. And at these times, antibiotics are very important in our ability to live a long and prosperous life. The pre-antibiotic era was different to the era we live in today. We've grown up in a very golden age. We don't expect to see or entertain the idea of an epidemic outbreak of a bacterial disease with high morbidity or mortality. Instead, we're complacent and often ignorant of the dangers, and we expect a quick visit to the doctor to cure us of all ills. Antimicrobial resistance, or AMR, as you might hear it referred to today, emerged very early following the introduction of penicillin, and can develop from inappropriate use, incomplete use during a course of drug, or overuse in many areas, not just in humans. Once it develops, it can severely limit the drug choices available to us. So, our story today begins with the Jones family. And believe me, you do not want to keep up with these Joneses. Sue and John are driving with their two children, 18-year-old Sally and 15-year-old Sam, when they have a very bad car accident. All of them are badly injured, have contaminated wounds, and are admitted to the Royal Melbourne Hospital and the Royal Children's Hospital. All of them requiring surgery, screws, plates for broken limbs, and a perforated bowel for Sally. After surgery, they are placed on broad-spectrum antibiotics. Almost immediately, Sally is doing badly. She has fever, sepsis, and generalised infection, and is placed in ICU. Her blood cultures on admission return positive results within 48 hours and are identified as a Klebsiella bacteria that is resistant to the antibiotic meropenem. Essentially, this means that bacteria is in her blood, probably from the bowel, and is resistant to a last-line antibiotic. The family has never travelled overseas. Kirsty, this is the third case of meropenem resistance this week. Is this odd?
So this is very odd. We do see meropenem-resistant bacteria from time to time in the hospital, but to be honest, I would estimate we might see a handful of cases a year at most. So to hear that there's one case and that it's in a person who's very recently come in from the community, so hasn't had a lot of healthcare contact and opportunities to perhaps acquire the infection in hospital, and indeed somebody who hasn't travelled, which we know is a risk factor for having a more resistant pathogen, this would definitely draw my interest to say there's something funny going on here. And the fact that it's the third one that we've had in recent times, particularly, I think if it's in a short period of time, I'd be very, very concerned that something's going on, that there's either transmission going on between individuals or there's a source in the community that might be causing this to happen. But as a clinician, looking at a patient in the ICU who's got bacteria in their blood, the first thing you'd be thinking about is I need to get on and treat this person with antibiotics. If the reports come back and said it's resistant to meropenem, it would probably also be giving me information about resistance to other common antibiotics that I might have available on the shelves in the hospital. And in the majority of cases where it's meropenem resistant, it's often resistant to all of those other agents as well. So I'd be looking for an agent on the shelf that I could grab hold of and give to her quickly. And I guess an example, there are many ways that you might manage this, but an example of something that I might do if I was on the ward or if I was called overnight is perhaps look for a drug called Colistin and try to get a dose into this patient quickly while we ask Deb and her team to get us more information about other drugs that might be effective here.
Okay, thank you. So Deb, the samples are sent to you. The family's never travelled. You received them and all of these cases, all the cases. How do you investigate what's going on here?
So, well, there is a well-oiled machine in MDU that would spring into action, I guess, involving a team of people, so ranging from bioinformaticians, microbiologists, epidemiologists, and bench scientists. So the sample would come to MDU. We would sequence the sample, so we perform whole genome sequencing. So that's where you look at, I guess, every single nucleotide in the bacteria. And we'd compare that to other bacteria that we had in our database. And our bioinformaticians would do what we call a phylogenetic analysis, where we look and see how related they are to other bacteria. What's important here is that with the beauty of that kind of data, that kind of genomic data, is that we don't just, we can compare it to things that we have sequenced here, but also we can pull down publicly available sequence data as well and compare that to things that have been deposited publicly from international sources as well. One thing I think it's important to think about, and Kirsty mentioned this, are risk factors here. So up until about 5-6 years ago, almost all of these carbapenem-resistant bacteria were imported, but now only about 60% of them, although the majority, 60%, are imported. We know that there is some local transmission that occurs in Victoria. So we'd collate all of that information and work with actually other people in this building as well, so particularly the Vicness team, and then report back to the health department.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Deb. So Brett, Deb notifies you of these results. What does State Health Department do?
Well, we're part of that epidemiology investigation. So really there's an opportunity for us to try and get the backstory for these individuals. So whoever has a case diagnosis and an isolate gets a map of where they've been in the previous period of time, 12 months. And if they haven't travelled overseas, that's absolutely the red flag. But what we're trying to work out here is getting the genomic information, that phylogenetic tree that tells us that there's a relationship, and then the relationship in time and space. And so we would look for where they've crossed over, and we would hope that there's an answer there. For a great majority now of our isolates, we can find that out, and we can work out that they're in adjacent beds or on the same ward, or that they've gone to the same healthcare facility at a similar time, or if not exactly the same time.
Yep. Do we start some kind of surveillance screening program?
No, I think we try and understand the relatedness and to get an answer about local transmission. If we haven't got that answer, then we go back to the drawing board.
Right. And if we did start a surveillance program, what would be the best kind of sample type to go for?
I mean, when we're screening in a ward, if someone hasn't been isolated, we get a fecal specimen. If we can't get a fecal specimen, we get a rectal swab. But if people have wounds, like in car accidents, or if they have a catheter, or if they have a tube down their throat, if they're in ICU, then we can get samples from those areas as well.
Yeah. So at the moment, we've only got a few cases. It's not many. What kind of levels do we need to get? Like, how many more alerts in the coming weeks make you really terrified?
Certainly if we got tens, we would be absolutely concerned. But it's enough now, if we haven't got a link to international travel, for us to be suspicious about local transmission or some other
Yeah.
source, and to be looking at it really hard.
Yep. Okay. So Sally's condition improves and then deteriorates when she's put on the drug Colistin, and she's very, very sick in ICU. She already has meropenem resistance to a last-line drug. Now she's on Colistin. Kirsty, how is she monitored in this context, and what happens from here if she starts failing the Colistin therapy?
So clinically, she sounds like she's in ICU, so she's clinically being monitored to see if she's responding to the treatment we're giving her, and if there's a sense that she's not responding, we would often take more samples, do more investigations to try to ask the question why. We'd be asking, has she got another infection, a different infection that we're not treating, or has something happened to this first bug that she had? Is it resistant to the... We've had to guess at giving her Colistin, so we may not know for sure whether the isolate is susceptible to Colistin, so we'd be asking the laboratory to help us out there. And I guess we'd be regularly re-examining her and working through our investigations again to try to work out why she's not improving.
Yeah. So if she's on Colistin, what would drive the resistance level or resistance developing to that drug?
Well, I guess the straightforward answer to that is exposure to Colistin can drive generation of resistance to Colistin. We talk about selection of resistant clones that might already exist, or a mutation might happen during treatment that allows resistance to develop. So that is something that we would be thinking about.
Yeah. And are there any other drugs in the drawer at this point, like access to novel drugs or anything like that?
Yes, we would have, right from the beginning, we would have had a recognition that Colistin is not a great drug. It's a drug that has a lot of toxicity attached to it. Many patients don't tolerate it for a very long time, and they can develop side effects like kidney failure. So we would have already been looking very hard for alternatives to this drug, and we would have been liaising quite closely with our microbiology colleagues to ask them to set up additional tests for drugs. Some of the things we would think through would be some newer drugs that have recently become available that are very, very expensive, but that we would perhaps reach for in this type of circumstance. We'd be looking at any of the existing drugs, we'd be looking at whether pushing the doses of some of those drugs might get us across the line. If we're really desperate, that's something we sometimes would do. We would sometimes think about combinations of therapy in the hope that maybe we get some synergy from drugs in combination. So, and then I guess last line we'd be thinking about what sort of novel agents are there out there that we've heard about in the research realm, and talking to colleagues from drug companies about investigational drugs if we really feel like things are getting desperate.
Yeah. So as bad luck would have it, both Sally and Sam, the children, develop Colistin resistance. So Sally's at the Royal Melbourne Hospital, Sam's at the Royal Children's Hospital. What does this mean for the wards they're on and the ICU that Sally's in?
Well, I guess the infection prevention team at both of those hospitals would be on high alert here. I'm not aware, though Brett may tell me, but I'm not aware we've had isolates with Colistin resistance very much at all. So this would be a really novel event, and we'd be letting the health department know quite quickly. From a practical point of view, we'd be looking at ways to minimise transmission of this isolate to anyone else. So we'd be trying to manage both of these patients in single rooms. We'd be looking at what we call contact precautions, which is around wearing gowns and gloves and things to try to minimise the potential for healthcare workers to be transmitting the infection to other patients or staff members. We'd be looking at equipment that might be shared between staff. So really thinking very hard about locking this down and containing it and trying to minimise any chance that it's going to spread anywhere else.
Yeah. Okay, Deb, further samples have been sent to you, and we've found that of those samples that are suspicious, about 20% of these have carbapenem resistance, and they're genetically linked to the first cases, the index cases of the Jones family, and they have a closest match to a strain found in Southeast Asian fish farms including prawns. So it seems like there's some kind of widespread human colonisation event. How do we find out what's occurred, and how do we further our investigation with that?
Well, that's pretty fishy. Yeah, so good question. 20% is a lot, I think, is the first.
So this is just the targeted samples that were potentially
a targeted
suspicious.
sample of patients who may have epidemiological, I guess, connections with the first patient that I guess would be concerned, but less concerned if that was, I guess, a community sample, for example. That would raise, massive red flags. So I guess the things that we would do then would be, firstly, just to say that food and waterborne outbreaks of resistant pathogens have been well described before, and in fact, there's an ongoing one, around 6,000 patients now, I believe was the last case count of extensively drug-resistant Salmonella typhi in Pakistan, which is thought to be driven by fecally contaminated municipal water. And so I guess finding it in a fish farm where there may be contact with human or animal effluent, I guess, in aquaculture, would not be entirely surprising. We would do a number of things. One is, I think, we'd double-check our analysis and triple-check our analysis to make sure that was actually the case. The second, I think, from a public health laboratory perspective, we would, I guess, activate our networks, if you like. So through PHLN, we'd certainly let them know, depending on whether it would probably even go through the IHR. I guess the health department would do that. So the international health regulations. There, I guess, informally, we'd pick up the phone to some of our colleagues in different public health agencies. And other things. Do
we do any food testing?
Yeah, well, I guess it would depend on where the food came, whether the food was here or not.
Yeah.
But certainly, if there was food samples that we thought were related to that outbreak, we can certainly test them at MDU. And anything that we grew from those food samples, we would sequence and try and see how related they were to isolates from humans.
Yeah. Okay. So bread. Bad prawns, mass colonisation event, potentially. What does health department do on receiving this information?
Yeah, I mean, it would be unprecedented for us to have a foodborne outbreak in Australia that has multidrug-resistant organisms. We're used to looking at person-to-person transmission, so this is novel territory for sure.
New.
And but we're very used to looking at foodborne outbreaks, and a bit like clinical work. It's all in the history to start with. So you really want the food histories from all of these individuals. What have you eaten in the previous month? And you go through a comprehensive trawling list. And when you get common items, you start to look at a case control study and to see whether people are much more likely to have eaten prawns, implicated prawns or something else. And if you can get those samples that might be left in the fridge, that might have been thrown in the bin, but especially if they're unopened packages, that's when you've got the smoking gun. And if we found that, that's when, yes, we're kicking off discussions with WHO. We would have a multi-jurisdictional outbreak investigation probably launched, although that normally involves other states and territories having cases. But if it's got distribution across Australia, we'd be worried that we've got a widespread foodborne outbreak and that a food recall, if we pin it down, would be part of that as well. Yeah,
but we communicate all this internationally and local, federally as well. Yeah.
Federally, we've got the Communicable Disease Network Australia, so the heads of communicable diseases departments would be talking about kicking off an MJOI. We've got AusFoodNet, the Food Epidemiologists Network, and my counterparts, the chief health officers in other states and territories, would probably convene a AHPPC out of session, teleconference to talk it through.
Any food recall or public health warning at
I
this stage?
think so. The definition of unsafe food in the food standards is food that causes illness or could cause illness if it's eaten in the way that it's intended to be without further kill step, as it were. So if these are prawns that are already cooked and canned and they're just being eaten as is, then then that's a danger, and you would do a consumer recall where it comes off all shelves, the entire distribution chain, and you're asking people to get it out of their fridges.
ASAP.
ASAP.
Okay, Joe, you've run the gauntlet of acquiring drug-resistant TB following a visit to Papua New Guinea. From a personal perspective, what was it like undergoing the treatment regimen and dealing with the uncertainty of the treatment outcome in that journey?
I guess because I've been a health reporter for many years before I managed to become my own story, I was very well aware of this well-oiled machine that's been referred to here many times. So really from the time that I got the diagnosis, which in some ways was a relief because I'd had about a week and a half of nobody kind of knowing what was going on and nobody really listening to me when I kept saying, do you think it could be TB, drug-resistant TB, I'm in and out of Papua New Guinea, I've just done that story, and everyone said, no, it's just impossible, there's no way you could possibly have picked that up. So initially the first resistance was this resistance to hearing, I guess, and I do have a very distinct memory of leaving a private hospital with them waving me off initially saying, look, that was all a bit of a mystery, but we'll see you later. And then a specialist in a suit yelling across the car park, go straight to the Royal Melbourne. And sort of not wanting to come any closer than that, which was a bit terrifying. We've just had a surprise result come in. Anyway, luckily the care at the Royal Melbourne, bless you all, was infinitely better than what I had there. But you know, to find yourself in that, I was initially put in one of those sort of secure bubble rooms and felt like the boy in the bubble, and everybody was wrapped up and gowned and, you know, triple gloved and coming in and out of this air-controlled environment. And that's terrifying because and at the same time, because of my insight into the machine, I knew that all these things would be happening, places, you know, maybe my neighbourhood was being alerted, maybe work colleagues were being told. At this stage, they didn't know if I was infectious. I was feeling very guilty because I thought my choices around the work I do are now threatening my family and my community. So I was really worried about that. About a week before I got sick, I had been to visit my brother's brand new, long-awaited IVF baby and I kept thinking, what if I've taken it in there? Yeah. So calling him to say, go straight to your paediatrician was awful. You know, that was the worst moment I think that I had. And then, you know, to everyone's great relief, it turned out that my bug was sealed off. You know, it was, help me, Justin. It was.
But it was resistant.
It was in plural, and so I wasn't contagious. I wasn't breathing it out, which was just a lot more good luck than good management.
Relief. Yeah.
So fear about being Typhoid Mary, I guess, was one thing. And even once that was dealt with, certainly, you know, I've written stories and stories about the stigma attached to these things, and even within my own family and within circles of educated people, even though I was assuring them that I was never a threat, I'm not a threat, there were people that I didn't see for a very long time.
Yeah. What was the duration of the treatment?
18 months. They told
18 months.
18 months. So initially they said it could be 2 years, and I was It was a really nasty. It was the Daru bug that I had done the stories on. And I guess that's the other thing I should mention, that despite being fearful, I was also always kind of completely certain that I would be fine, that I was in one of the world's best hospital systems, and I've been in and out of the world's worst hospital systems, and I knew how privileged I was as a patient to have access to everything I needed. Yep. So even though I later discovered, and I apparently screened this out at the time, that even with all of that, it was 50-50, really. But I chose not to listen to that. I just knew that I was a lot luckier than the patients that I had written about many times. And so that was a big part of I guess I had a very positive attitude once we knew what we were dealing with.
Yeah. So positive attitude gets you so far. What about any side effects from the drugs or the treatment therapy itself?
Yeah, because they were trying everything. I mean, and they were, you know, they'd say, let's try these 6 or 7 things. And you know, and a lot of them were very new drugs that hadn't been tried before. And then I'd say, look, I'm getting I'm spinning out, I'm getting these weird tastes, there'd be, we'll try getting rid of that one, but you need to stay on this one. So there was just, I think at one stage I was on 7 or 8 different antibiotics at the same time, and they just said, we're nuking you. And I did feel, so there was a whole range of, fallout from that. And 18 months later, or in the years since, I guess I still deal with that. My microbiome was, completely kaput by the end of that process. Yeah.
So you already had some knowledge of the system. How do you think people don't have knowledge of that system? Do you think they'll cope or
possibly they wouldn't be maybe quite aware? I mean,
or will ignorance be bliss?
Yeah, I think it could be in that they wouldn't know the machinery that would be falling into place. I mean, in some ways that was reassuring, but it also made me feel if I'm contagious, I'm going to make a little bit of a history that I'd rather not. So I think, knowledge around that. But I also found what was very interesting, being a novel case within a system and having quite a lot of very interested people wanting to know what was going on here. They were very, maybe it's because I am interested and as a medical health writer, I perhaps had a degree of insight that lots of patients don't. They were very happy to answer my questions and to express what they didn't know as much as what they did know, and I found that really useful. But I would imagine maybe lots of patients don't want that kind of information. Yeah. I certainly found it was great to know where was the known landscape, and beyond that, where were we in uncharted territory.
Great, thank you. So now we've sampled a few more surveillance samples around Victoria, and there is indeed widespread community resistance. So resistance to the carbapenem class of drugs, and some now to pan-resistant to even the drug Colistin, a last-line antibiotic. So people who are well won't actually know they carry the resistant bacteria. So Brett, how does society change, or how does the threat of pan-resistant bacteria change the health system's approaches, and particularly the GP, general practice approaches to managing this?
It's really hard to say. I mean, this would be a watershed moment in history for Australia, because pan-resistance means we're back in the 1800s of the wet flannel on the forehead and trying to survive the fever, where there's literally nothing that can be done other than supportive care. So I think it becomes a transformative thing for the health system. There would need to be a really intensive engagement from a communications perspective. Government doesn't always do it well. I've made my own mistakes. Yep. But the general principle, I think, has to be open and honest and transparent and consistent, digestible information. So you would need to be really clear about what carriage is, what colonisation is and what infection is, yep. What you could do in the circumstances, and you'd try and emphasise the things around hand hygiene and food hygiene and isolation. But there's a scary story there, and it's really hard to shy away from that. I think the West African Ebola outbreak and the response in the United States, where people were in full-body condoms essentially in the airports, yep. People get supremely anxious, and in a sense it's an entirely human response. So I think you would need to meet people where they are, and you'd need to get in the social media world, because that's where information is really disseminating, and it'll be the Facebook stories and the Twitter stories and the networks of friends that can ramp things up, and you really need to be in that space.
Will there be complacency from people who obviously have the resistant bacteria, but because they're well, they just think there's no problem?
I'm not sure. I think people would feel the stigmatisation. They would feel the concern about potential transmission to others who are vulnerable, because that's a genuine risk. And if they might not be...
If they don't know they've got it, are they worried? Or?
Well, I think people would change their behaviours, but there would be real difficulties in knowing exactly what to do. It would be a fundamentally disempowering event, because there aren't clear things that you can do to make yourself well. There aren't clear things that you can do to protect others, and that would be hard, not having that locus of control to be able to manage it.
Yep. Thanks, Brett. So, Mark, you work in the pharmaceutical drug development space. Why is it so difficult to get new antibiotics to market?
There's a large number of reasons.
Yep.
not least of which is
Feel free to look just at the audience, that's fine. Rather than do your neck, yeah.
So the bar that you have to leap to get a new medicine registered is probably larger than most people appreciate. And there are lots of statistics out there about how much money goes into a new drug and how long it takes. But the reality of it is that it is incredibly expensive. It is extremely time-consuming, and it doesn't matter whether you're working in diseases that we are used to seeing day in, day out, or diseases of low and middle income countries, which is my own area, or antimicrobial resistance. It doesn't matter. You have to hit exactly the same bar. It's a very high bar, and it takes a lot of money to do the work. So, for example, to illustrate just how tough it is, it's roughly about 40 drugs per year that are novel are registered through the US FDA. That's their rough annual hit rate. The expenditure on R&D by industry is about $170 billion per year. So that's the rough market hit rate and the cost. And for those 40 drugs, there were a further 360 that entered into clinical trials that failed, let alone how many thousands of other ones that failed before you even began clinical trials. So the failure rate is vast. The risk is enormous, and it's things that you may not appreciate. I mean, for us, we're probably all familiar with clinical trials, but perhaps less familiar with some of the manufacturing problems, or that a drug-drug interaction may kill a drug off. You won't know that until you get into the clinic. Your role as a drug developer is the biology of the drug and the chemistry of the drug is fixed in time. And our job is to elucidate that, pull out that information, find out how long it takes for the drug to degrade at 40 degrees in 85% humidity and 28 degrees in 75% humidity, how quickly it will go off in light, how difficult it will be to manufacture it. Will it stick to the vessel? Will it fly off in the air? Is it explosion risk? Do you have to build a special facility to manufacture it? And many antibiotics require their own specific facilities. So, how much it costs to build a swimming pool. A lot of these stuff have to be manufactured within effectively a swimming pool in case there's a spill. So, cost, and more time. And at the end of the day, you're going to put it on the shelf and no one's going to prescribe it, hopefully. So you've got a classic example of market failure, and market failure is a thing of passion for me, but it's a thing of passion for us as a society. As a society, we feel that we need medicines that are available to people, no matter who you are, no matter where you are, and for no matter what condition. And over here on the right side, in the world that we live in, our bubble, which is we live in a wealthy country, and we expect to get treated when we go to the doctor. But pretty much everyone else is not in that environment. And this is one of those examples where it's crossing over that setting from we expect to go and get a treatment and it's not available. And it's because of the same reason that people who live in low and middle income countries can't get drugs. So that's the area for us.
So the cost kind of ethical balance there, if you like, is it a fundamental failing of capitalism and the shareholder profit-driven mentality of drug development in that context, or is it something else that drives the investment dilemma?
I think we're really asking a lot of the pharmaceutical industry, which is set up as a shareholder-owned organisation to make a profit, to answer the questions when there's no profit at the end of it. That's really not their job. And for most other areas that we have, there is a private and a public pairing. But in the pharmaceutical industry, there's just a private element, or shareholder. It's not private, it's owned by us. So for me, the area that we're missing in the pharmaceutical development is that money is not being spent on pharmaceutical development outside of the pharmaceutical industry at the level that it needs to for us to address these problems.
Does government need to be involved hand in hand?
Absolutely.
Or, yeah.
And I find that that very rarely do government fully understand the extent of what's involved in the cost. But also that there's no point just looking over to the industry to please answer these questions for us. We need to answer these questions and we need to address these problems. And it requires the funding to be there. And government is one of the best sources.
So ethics and all those things, even just from our perspective here in the Doherty, we know are horrendous. And obviously for a drug development angle, it's even worse. Could they, maybe I'll ask Brett, could these be bypassed in a catastrophe scenario like this?
I think we'd have to seriously consider it. Legislation and regulation can be really clunky. There are things that are strange that constrain us in ways because we didn't conceive of the way that the world might be all of a sudden.
Yep.
But crisis brings people together in ways that make them creatively think about how they can get around stuff.
Yep.
And in desperate circumstances, you can get things through cabinet faster, but it's not overnight. And we are a federation of states and territories, each with our own public health act of whatever kind, and that's really tricky. For example, in Victoria, faeces comes under the Human Tissue Act, so we can't have it sold, advertised, claim a therapeutic benefit without ministerial approval.
Yep.
But that's not the same in every state and territory.
Yep, thank you. Okay, so back to the Joneses. Mum and Dad, Sue and John, have recovered from their surgery at the Royal Melbourne Hospital. John is still unwell, extremely tired and fatigued. Sally, luckily, the daughter, has recovered, albeit she has pan-resistance bacteria in her gut, but she has recovered. But she also has a large hernia from this perforation. And as a young person with an Instagram account and wanting to look good in the summer, she wants to have this hernia corrected. Kirsty, what does resistance mean for elective surgery?
So I think it's important to stop and slow down and think carefully about this because this is, as you say, elective surgery, and as there's no pressing medical need for her to have it. It's largely for cosmetic reasons, as I understand. And so what I'd be thinking through is the fact that if she does go and have this operation, and presumably they put a piece of mesh in to try to contain the hernia, she's likely to be given antibiotics. If she's likely to be given antibiotics, we might select out this resistant pathogen from her gut again. And there is always a risk with a surgical procedure that you might get a surgical site infection. And I'd be thinking through this horrendous possibility that she might get an infected mesh with an untreatable bacteria, and that would be an absolute disaster. She'd be left there with presumably, best case scenario, a discharging sinus on her abdomen forever. So this could be...
So once the implant is colonised, that's it?
Yeah, it might be untreatable.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's worst case scenario, but I think we're challenged to think about these things in patients who are colonised with these pathogens. I'm not saying she couldn't have it done, but I think you'd have to do some careful counselling with her and think quite carefully about the risks and benefits before proceeding to something that wasn't absolutely necessary.
And what about emergency surgery, like with the context of large percentages of resistance in the community? Yeah. Do they get pre-screened or what happens?
So that's a really controversial issue. So emergency surgery, it has to happen. And for a lot of operations, we do give antibiotic prophylaxis or a preventative dose of antibiotics beforehand. So I'd be thinking through, depending on the procedure, what are the likely bacteria that might cause a surgical site infection, and should I be thinking about varying my antibiotic prophylaxis if I knew somebody was colonised? In most cases, the answer is that we don't, though there are exceptions. If you knew somebody was carrying MRSA, you often do give a dose of vancomycin in prophylaxis for an infection, for a procedure like a heart operation, for example. And in the case of these carbapenem-resistant pathogens, the procedure that stands out that we would worry about might be a prostate operation where we know it's very close to the rectum, and those bowel bugs are often involved in the infections that might complicate the procedure. So I don't have a straightforward answer except to say that we'd be thinking about it very carefully, and we'd be thinking about it procedure by procedure probably.
Yep. Joe, how do you think the community as a public person, will react to this kind of decision process between, or balancing the risk and consequence of elective surgery? Like it could be from an angle like this where there's a hernia, or there could be something like a face, nose job, whatever it is, something.
As a citizen or as a journalist?
As a citizen. Journalist comes later.
Okay. So yes, assuming I'm party to this conversation in my reading, I guess my temperament would be to be listening to what the doctors tell you and to be playing it very conservatively. But I would imagine that there are, this is a very complex field, obviously, and you're feeling your way in it, even as specialists who know the territory. I think it's communications-wise, this is a really difficult issue to be communicating, and so I think the scope for confusion and misinformation is obviously enormous. But I think I'd be, being of the nature that I am,
happy with the doctors.
Happy to do as I'm told.
Yep, great. Okay, at this time, John, the father, is diagnosed with leukemia, requiring chemotherapy. I told you these Joneses were unlucky. So Kirsty, with carbapenem-resistant bacteria himself, his daughter with Colistin and resistant bacteria, what are the dangers for John?
So this is quite a worrying situation. If he's got leukemia, you said he's going to likely to need some heavy-duty chemotherapy, and with that comes suppression of the immune system, and people are definitely more at risk of getting quite serious bacterial infections. In a situation where chemotherapy is given, often people's neutrophil count, their white blood cell count goes very low, and then one of the sources of infection is often bacteria coming from the gut into the bloodstream, and these patients can become septic, very sick very quickly. So you would be making sure that the clinicians looking after John knew that he was colonised and knew that he was a high-risk patient. And by this stage, if we knew anything about what antibiotics might work for his isolate, we'd be having them on hand, because we'd be expecting he may well become septic at some point during his therapy, and that we may need to reach for these high-powered drugs very quickly. So I'd be developing a plan for what to do when he became septic.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So Deb, with increased up to 20% of the population with carbapenem-resistant bacteria colonising their gut, having recently eaten the prawns, now some pan-resistance developing, does this resistance spread amongst the community to uninfected people?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to think about what the mode of transmission here is. And for a bug like Klebsiella, it would be fecal-oral transmission would be the primary mode of transmission. And so absolutely, this could spread in the community. And we've seen that with other resistant bugs. ESBLs would be a clear example of that, where once they were confined to the hospital setting, and now they're prevalent in the community setting as well. So yes, they can spread. What's also important is that it's not just the bacteria that can spread, but the bits of DNA, the mobile genetic elements that the resistance genes are carried on, can also transfer between bacteria. So we're looking at bacterial spread, but we're also looking at gene or plasmid spread as well, because bacteria are extremely clever. And so it's really, as both Kirsty and Brett have mentioned, it essentially becomes a sort of Darwinian struggle here of us against the bacteria. So absolutely they can spread. What's, I guess, important to note, though, is that some of the systems that we've got now, particularly when we're thinking about genomic surveillance, we can track and we can monitor the spread of these resistance genes and the context in which they occur, so the plasmids and the bacteria. So
there's potential to spread to other bacteria species in the gut, and are they monitored along with the Klebsiella and the
yes,
one that
yes. So
originated in?
carbapenem producing Enterobacterialis, which is, I guess, the family in which the Klebsiella occur, we look for them.
Yeah. So would we expect, again, I might go back to Brett, would we expect a wider surveillance program in healthy individuals at this point, or would we do it from sewage, or just to get a look, or what would the angles be?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look for where it sits. And
Yep.
obviously, for those who've eaten the prawns, that's where the focus would be, and you'd have intensive surveillance among those individuals. Because one of the positive aspects is that colonisation might be overcome, and that especially people with a good immune system who are young and otherwise healthy, they might get rid of those bacteria.
So it can naturally go away.
Yeah, and that would be a useful research piece to understand, because that would provide either great reassurance or lack of it to the broader community.
How long does it normally take to just naturally go away or subside or get outnumbered, whatever it is?
We don't really know, and there's always that issue of reselecting when there's an antibiotic challenge. But there's certainly a percentage who you can no longer detect it at a 12-month mark, but it's a question yet to be answered definitively.
Okay. Joe, things are getting worse in this story. As a journalist, so this is with your journalist hat on, how do you pitch this story to balance the reality and the fear and get that educational message across without it sounding like a zombie apocalypse?
I think no, zombie apocalypse, that's
good?
my editors listening.
Okay.
Those 2 words.
Sells newspapers, right?
So good luck rolling that back. Once that's escaped you, and it's like when I was writing stories about MDR-TB, I mean, people would turn off until I said it's Ebola with wings. And it's not overstating it. It is Ebola with wings, and it's on this terrible time release too, where you know the fire starts long after this thing's found its way out in the world. So zombie apocalypse, Ebola with wings, these are the kind of things that we need to break through the kind of the clickbait reality of disrupted media, which we have now, which is a really wild, disinforming space, as we all know, for lots of reasons. And one of the things that's occurred as a result of the media disruption and the hollowing out of newsrooms as a consequence of Facebook, Google, and the whole horror, is that you've lost expertise amongst specialists. So when I became the health and medical reporter, I inherited that role from another very well-regarded health and medical reporter. I was given time to basically, I remember working the traps in this Parkville precinct, introducing myself, getting to know people, starting to feel my way around some of the issues and stories, and developing long-term relationships. So that if I'd had a whiff of this story, I would have been coming here and I would have known who to talk to and how to put it in an appropriate context. The reality is now that those reporters are really not there. There's still a handful of them, and you've still got obviously some excellent journalism being produced out of the ABC, as long as it's funded, and The Guardian, and a few, and The Age as well has some great specialists. But you've got TV news, radio news, all sorts of online publishers who are just going to ramp up the zombie apocalypse and are not going to be putting that within a broader framework. So I think and this is something I think about a lot in terms of climate change science and reporting, is how do we, I think the idea of maybe anticipating that this is going to come and that you're going to need some level of information and responsibility to be imparted in newsrooms, maybe the way to think about that is to kind of send in advance teams to talk to some of the people who are the gatekeepers, so news editors, because they're the ones who are going to be dispatching the 22-year-old who's just walked out of university and has now been assigned the zombie apocalypse beat. So I think to be able to have some information and resources and some backgrounding of the gatekeepers might be the best way to try and manage this sort of event.
We seem to almost have a polarised media in a way. Like there's the reputable media and the clickbait media that you describe that's driven by social media and news feeds and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of getting the reputable educational messages across, as we lose the battle in terms of proportion of people that just go to the quick and easy Facebook feed, how do we get or try to rebalance that kind of news angle to actually educate?
I wish I knew. And this is what we're wrestling with all the time. and I think the only way that I can, there's been a lot of eyeballs and a lot of intellect, in journalism schools and newsrooms all around the world trying to figure out a way to continue to produce quality journalism in a landscape that really doesn't allow for it. The only mechanism that seems to be supporting the good stuff now is either the subscription model, so things like The Guardian, and there's a couple of others in Europe that are very interesting, and the Correspondent amongst others. That model is coming up, responsible state media, and philanthropically supported journalism, which is still not very strong in this country, but is in other places. I think it's only when you get that kind of critical mass of that quality reporting that you might begin to get some traction against the crap. But I mean, we only have to look at the sort of information that's shared around immunisation to see the kind of formidable force that we're working against here. So I think it's just got to be like like my treatment, nuke it, but with good quality
maybe
stuff.
Brett can step in there with a strong public health message, I guess. But
and I think it's one for us all to line up together on. It's not about only government telling the story, but I think if we're going to get in the space, then I need to be doing podcasts and blogs and be on Facebook in order to be in the space if people aren't going to traditional media. Yep.
Mark, at this point we've got a really bad scenario evolving in the community. Is there a shift in the pharmaceutical company models at this point? Do they apply to government for altered approaches, or what would be done now?
I think there is a shift in the models. I think it has less to do with the pharmaceutical industry and more to do with increasing the options to take research ideas through all of the development steps that are necessary through approval and making things available. So there are efforts in that. There are what are called product development partnerships that have been set up for various diseases, malaria being one, TB being another. There's now one that's been set up for antimicrobial resistance. These are funded through philanthropy and through governments. And I think that we need to increase the push on the pharmaceutical industry to do more in their own capacity, but understand that that's going to have a limitation, and that if we want to address what the pharmaceutical industry does, which is do drug development, we need other mechanisms for that. So there's not enough, and there needs to be a lot more for us to really have an impact in this area.
Yeah, thank you. So understanding of the human microbiome and the world of microbes that live on us and inside of us has expanded greatly in the last few years and may offer some help. Fecal matter transplants, or poo transplants, are becoming more recognised as a treatment option. Kirsty, how do these poo transplants work and what are they used for?
So these fecal transplants are they're procedures by which we try to replace an abnormal or diseased gut flora with a non-diseased gut flora. So the way that they work is that a donor's stool is obtained and basically it's administered into the recipient via a number of means. The most common is probably colonoscope, where an endoscope is put into the bowel and the fecal material from the donor is directly instilled into the colon. And the idea is that the healthy bacteria will outcompete the diseased bacteria so that the gut will be colonised by healthy microbiome again. And it's most commonly used nowadays for a particular condition called Clostridium difficile colitis. So it's a condition that is the result most often of antibiotic use that selects out a pathogenic bacteria that produces a toxin and causes disease in the colon. So by overwhelming the colon with healthy bacteria, we hope that it outcompetes those diseased bacteria. And there's good evidence that it works for that particular condition.
Yep. So presumably the search is on for good donors. Brett, how do we promote a poo bank to collect good donors and a screening service?
I think it'd become a national conversation, again, with all of the constraints around legislation. And then, if you're making a therapeutic claim, you've got the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods bar to get over. And it's not easy if you're talking about an entirely novel therapy that isn't a single chemical that can be tested in lots of ways. This is why medicinal cannabis is tricky for registration, because you're talking about 200 compounds. So if you're talking about a whole bunch of bacteria where you actually don't know what it might do in the space, I think it would need to start as a research project.
Yep.
But we could make it happen in dire circumstances, I'm sure.
Yep. So the poo pill is looking more and more like a viable option. As a temporary stopgap measure, Joe, as a member of the public, is this pill too bitter to swallow?
Well, I told you one of my concerns after treatment and surviving TB was what the long-term effects were. So continuing what could be seen as deeply self-absorbed, lazy journalism, using myself as my subject. I actually did a piece for the Monthly about this as both a citizen and a journalist, and a couple of years ago, and I contacted the Australian Gut Project and said, I'm a journalist, I want to do a story about the microbiome and where it's going and fecal transfer, and I'd like to offer myself, as a subject, and I endeared myself to them by saying, you'll have never seen shit like my shit. It's going to be. And I didn't tell them the backstory and went up and visited them and gave them... That's a good one. Went up and gave them... I wish I'd used that in the story. I used pretty much every other one that I could have. But so I went up and I deposited my sample, and... research scientists being well known for their bedside manner. I remember this guy, he sent me an email saying, you are most atypical for a human. And the only thing we've ever seen like you is the kakapo, which is an endangered New Zealand parrot. And I looked it up on the internet, and it's a fat parrot, and it's doing quite well now, and thanks to its antibiotic treatment. But I did find in doing that story, the amount of DIY fecal transplant in Google land is horrifying, and so there's plenty of people who are interested in it. For all, they think it's going to cure obesity. It's going to do.
So just interrupting you there, will a desperate patient do anything? Pretty
much. I mean, there's I don't know how many of you have Googled this, but you can get online and you can find out how to do a little home transfer kit with your nearest and dearest and whoever you think might have gold-plated shit,
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I think there's people would be into
interested,
it, and I think that like so many things, they can get past the yuck factor if there's some level of
as soon as you're desperate, you're desperate.
Yeah. So I don't think it's too far gone, and in fact, if anything, now there is quite a large amount of expectation building around what this is, and yet at the moment, the last time I looked, it's still only proven to be working in that particular area that you talked about. So.
Okay. So Mark, for the pharmaceutical industry, can the poo pill be made, or is it best to leave to the naturopaths and the home internet remedies?
So naturopaths, there was a quote about a naturopath, the naturopathic medicine that works is called a medicine. So I'm not a massive fan of the naturopathic world. The poo pills is a challenge, to say the least. I think, in addition to what's already been described, I think about risk and virus risks that may be within there, other pathogens that you just haven't characterised. So the moment you've got what's technically called in the biologics world a gamish, and there's very little that's more of a gamish than shit. So the moment you've got that, you are in a realm of very poor characterisation and really hard to quantify risks that would keep me awake at night for sure. So you'd want to be working out what the biology was, which ingredients, which bacteria you really wanted, and I'd grow them up artificially and assemble it artificially to get rid of those risks.
Okay. Kirsty, the poo transplants have been used and they've been very successful for certain conditions, but there are some suggested risks and unexpected side effects. What are they, and can you elaborate on them?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's really that we don't have a lot of data on the long-term potential impacts of this. So I guess there's the direct mechanical problems related to installation. So there have been cases where patients have done poorly because they've aspirated the poo we've tried to instill it via the upper gastrointestinal tract. But I think more importantly, or as importantly, what's going on in terms of the specific microbiome that we're inserting. So the microbiome, the good bacteria there do a lot of things for us. We think they educate our immune system. They probably have a part in regulating our metabolic system. And you know, what happens when we drastically change that in an individual person? So there's definitely animal models in which we can show that fecal transplants are associated with changes in you know, moving from a skinny mouse to a fat mouse, or development of diabetes, or indeed there's been some associations with perhaps a particular microbiome perhaps being associated with malignancies, bowel cancers, for example. So how would we track this sort of thing if we were just randomly picking different donors and instilling them in different people, and then when a complication happens down the track, was it related to that donor stool or not? So I think in addition to what Mark's already mentioned about the unknown infection potential risks there too of other organisms that might be being transferred in the fecal material. So it's a big unknown.
So in some ways it almost behaves like its own organ.
It does, yeah. I think the bacteria that live in our gut are like a whole different organ that we're carrying, and we're basically transplanting an organ there, aren't we? And not knowing what the downstream effects are.
Sure. And there's been some suggestion that even depression has been transmitted or transferred.
True. Yeah. There's associations with mental health conditions too. So a lot of this is very difficult to track.
Yeah. So from car crash to train wreck, we've examined what some of the aspects of antimicrobial resistance may involve on the community. The change of usage, surgical practice, changes to the drugs themselves, or the use of the poo pill may buy us some time. Finally, Deb, can the virologist step in here with viruses specifically targeting bacteria?
Well, Julian, speaking as a bacteriologist, I would just point out a couple of things. One, bacteriophages have evolved to become quite clever because bacteria have helped them get that way. And I guess, secondly, I think I would see phages as more of a collaboration between viruses and bacteria. But I certainly think that they do have a role to play. So formerly they were sort of, I wouldn't say totally disregarded, but they were confined to certain, their use was confined to certain parts of the world. So I guess Russia and other, I guess, Eastern European countries. But there certainly have been some extremely promising case reports now where they've been used very successfully, including one actually this week from Australia where phages were used as adjunctive therapy in a very severe case of Staph aureus endocarditis. So I do think that is something that we should be looking at quite extensively in the future. So in short, yes, viruses have a helpful supporting role to play here.
Supporting role anyway, dear, oh dear, oh dear. Okay, look, we will end it there, but I'd first like to thank Dr. Arjun Rajkaur, who's in the audience, and Professor Sharon Lewin, who also helped putting this narrative together. And can we please put our hands together for our wonderful panel today?